Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
What's happening to all the younger dentists? I've talked about this a little bit in prior episodes, especially ones where I discuss anything having to do with current demographics in the industry and the opportunities they present for practice acquisition. But the more I'm digging into this as I work on our preparations for the upcoming MG Owners Conference, the clearer it's becoming. We have a big problem in the dental industry, and it's bigger than we thought. It's actually a lot bigger. And this problem strikes right at the heart of the private practice of dentistry, and whether that's a model that's going to continue or not in its current form into the future. I think it should, but to do so, action will need to be taken across the boards. So whether you're a dentist that's under 35 and associating or an over 65 practice owner, the information in this episode applies to you. In other words, to make these changes, we're all going to have to lend a hand. So in a nutshell, what is the big problem? Well, we're on the cusp of what looks potentially to be a doctor shortage over the next 5 to 10 years, and younger doctors aren't picking up practices like they used to. As a matter of fact, quite a few of them are going to DSOs. And compounding that issue is the luster that DSOs had years back is becoming duller and duller. And if we don't change some of these patterns, the profession will look very different 10 to 15 years from now, or possibly sooner. So today, what I want to get into is why this is happening, the real reasons or the alleged real reasons younger dentists aren't buying practices as much anymore, and what we need to do about it before corporate dentistry becomes their only option. And spoiler alert, that option isn't as safe or as stable as it looks. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host, and I think the best place to start would be looking at the numbers. Where are we? So, I know numbers aren't a blast to listen to on a podcast, so I'll try to keep the percentages out. I'll round up. How's that? So let's look at some basics, and some of this you will have heard before, and some of it you will not. In 2005, around 85% of all U.S. dentists owned a practice. By 2023, we have 23 numbers. It used to be 2021. By 2023, that number had fallen to 73%. In 2005, a little over 25% of doctors under 30 were practice owners. By 2023, that number is less than 9%. And for dentists aged 30 to 34, ownership has gone from 55% in 2005 to a little under 33% in 2023. In the 35 to 44 age bracket, ownership has gone from, in 2005, around 86% to 71%. So ownership has been dropping all across the brackets. So who still owns a lot of practices? Well, the older age bracket, doctors 55 and over, about 90% of them own their dental practices. So keep these numbers in mind. Why is ownership dropping amongst the younger demographics? Well, based on surveys and questions and things of that nature, the issues that got brought up the most are student debt, lifestyle choices, and DSOs. But there's a little bit more to it which I want to unpack. And the reason I want to get into this, the reason I am doing this episode is this is why this becomes critical. And I want to explain this without it getting ridiculous to explain in a podcast. But normally when you see demographic age breakdowns that the ADA publishes, they'll do 10-year brackets. So, 35 to 44 and 45 to 54 and so on. It doesn't break down things in the middle, which to some degree is critical. For instance, if I tell you that the average retirement age of a dentist is 69, well, then you could look at it and go, okay, if someone's 59, there's a pretty good chance they're going to retire in the next 10 years. It's not definite, but there's a pretty good chance they're going to retire if the average age is 69. But if the demographic I'm looking at is, for that 60-year-old is between 55 and 64, how many of them are over 60 and how many are under 60? You can't really tell who's retiring. So what I did for my projections here, I took the ADA's numbers and I crunched them a bit and by basically comparing them up against U.S. demographics. In other words, the average number of people, like if you break the U.S. population down, how many are 60 years old, how many are 61, how many are 62, and I broke the dental profession down the same way so I could actually advance these numbers to figure out what we're looking at with relation to doctors exiting the profession. Sorry about the kind of the nerdy explanation there, but I wanted to throw that out to you. So this is where this gets critical. As of 2023, we have over 100,000 dentists that are age 45 and older. Again, I've said this before. I'm not practicing ageism here. I'm over 45, and that's being kind. I'm actually over 50. Over 55, actually. But the point being is if you're 50 or 55, you're not going to work for another 30 plus years. I mean, you're going to work. You're most likely going to do it because you feel like it, not because you have to. You're not economically required to work anymore. So if I have a doctor who's 27, they're going to be in practice for a while versus a doctor who's 45, 55, and so on. Anyway, so as of 23, we have over 100,000 dentists age 45 and over. That's more than half of the current current profession. Profession's around 200,000. So based on current demographics, ownership rates, and actual retirement patterns, here's what we're projecting over the next decade, over the next 5 to 10 years, okay? So now I'm going to give you a high-end projection and a low-end projection, okay? That's what I'm doing, high-end and low-end. So at the low end, over the next 5 years, based on the current demographics in dentistry, we're looking at a little over 27,000 doctors retiring, okay? And these are conservative estimates, 27,000. At the high end, that's 35,000. So 27 to 35,000 doctors retiring over the next 5 years. Now, who's retiring? Doctors that are, going to be on average 69 years of age or older. Okay, well, remember, these folks own most of the practices if they're over 55, okay? Or over 65. So what does that mean as far as practices potentially for sale or changing hands or being shut over the next 5 years? At the low end, that's 23,000 dental offices. At the high end, that's 30,000 dental offices. And how about in 10 years from now? Well, based on these same projections, at the low end, we're looking at almost 66,000 dentists retiring. At the high end, we'd be looking at a little over 80,000 dentists retiring. That right now is 40% of the current practicing dentists over the next 10 years. That's what we're projecting at the high end. At the low end, it's 65,000, or 66 rather. Okay, so then what does that mean as far as practices for sale or changing hands in the next 10 years? At the low end, about 57,000. At the high end, we're looking at about 70,000. You starting to get the picture here? This is a major demographic shift, okay? So now this isn't a handoff. This is like a black hole. And here's where things get more serious, all right? While we've heard the ADA, and I'm not trashing the ADA. I love the ADA. I don't have a problem with them. But when you read the stuff about dentist replacements from the ADA, it's sort of like, don't worry about it. The profession's growing, etc. But if you look at the number of kids in school and the growth of number of kids in school, as well as cost of tuition, which is just astronomical compared to what it used to be, it's not growing fast enough to really keep – it's growing fast enough to keep things maybe static if we're lucky, but to actually have a shortfall, less practicing dentists in the next 5 to 10 years if we're not so lucky. How does that all pan out? Well, the average number of graduates, according to the ADA, is about 6,500 a year. And this is from all programs, to my understanding. This is, a foreign dentist comes and has to go back to school, as well as someone who just does their 4 years of dental school after coming from their undergrad in the U.S., okay? This is total, 6,500 new dentists a year. And the number has grown steadily. It's growing about 1% to 2% annually over the past few years. It's not growing fast, but that's how it's growing. So based on ADA workforce exit and entrance trends, how many new kids are coming out and how many people leaving the profession, we're looking at a shortfall, potentially, of about 3,000 dentists in the next 5 years, meaning 3,000 less practicing dentists, or potentially, if we're lucky, about 4,000 extra dentists, which isn't huge. If you think about it in 5 years, population growth alone will outstrip that, all right? That's the net change, okay? Then what does that look like over 10 years? Well, 10-year net growth, we're looking at approximately 70,000 new grads, okay? But we're looking at exits from the profession of being anywhere from 66 to 80,000. So we're going to have a net workforce change in dentistry of anywhere from maybe adding 4,000 dentists in 10 years by the year 2034 or 5, or losing 11,000 dentists, net dentists, meaning 11,000 less practicing dentists than are practicing right now. So even with dental school growth, the best case is flat to minimal growth. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is a workforce contraction of more than 10,000 doctors. And that's not a bottleneck. That is a profession-wide choke point, and it has real implications for practice ownership, given that 90% of dentists over 55 own their own practice and younger doctors aren't buying. So if we have the majority of whom own practices, the dentists 55 and over exiting the profession, or a large portion exiting the profession over the next 10 years, what are we losing? We're not just losing a doctor, we're losing a full business. These businesses are going to have to be sold, acquired, or just shut down entirely. And, we work with a lot of clients, and I'll see cases where they're buying a doctor who's retiring's charts, and, just as often as you'll see a large practice sell to a DSO. Because that's always been the thought, well, if I have to sell my practice or if someone's going to sell his practice, of course the DSOs are going to pick it up. We've talked about this before. DSO targets are not the practices doing $500,000 or $600,000 a year. They want practices that are doing at least $1 million, maybe 1.5 or 2, and that isn't all the dental practices. So if we look at the 50-something thousand practices at the low end that'll sell over the next 10 years, or the 70,000 at the high end that'll sell over the next 10 years, I don't really know how many of those fit the model to be a DSO target based on just the demographics of clients that we see, because we have clients from pretty much every economic demo you could imagine, meaning we have clients that come in that don't have a practice. They're an associate doctor, or they're doing $30,000 a month, and we have others that are doing $6 million a year. But if I were to take a look and compare our clients to the profession as a whole, I would estimate that maybe 20, maybe 25% at best are DSO targets, if they're lucky. So the majority aren't. So that means these tens of thousands of practices aren't going to be DSO targets. That doctor is either going to be closing the door and turning in the keys, selling their charts, or maybe possibly selling to a private owner. Or, it's not but that private owner, there aren't as many private owners as there were before. Okay? So we don't have enough dentists willing or trained to take over. We're staring down the barrel of shuttered offices, maybe in rural or I have trouble with that word, or underserved areas, which could create crises for access to care. And I think it's a massive missed opportunity. This is what we've been talking to clients about for years. The reason, I'm not getting on here to say this is what we talk to MGE clients about, and we tell them buy smaller practices that they can scale. Of course we do. I think this needs to become an overall professional movement within the profession where, not just MGE clients are doing this, where they're picking up doctors or retiring doctors' offices and either picking them up as a second or third location, whether you're a client or not, okay, or a younger doc going in and picking up this practice. Ideally, we should keep these practices going because they're great opportunities. That's essentially what I'm saying here. I want to create a little bit more of a movement. So then if this is the problem, okay, if this is the problem, what's wrong? Why are not enough younger doctors buying practices? Why is practice ownership down so much among the younger docs? I mean, I can tell you anecdotally what I've heard from younger doctors who are maybe associate doctors that do our program. But what's funny is it sort of agrees with some of the things that have come up in some of these surveys that have been done. And by the way, all of this data I'm pulling for you, I'm going to give you as links to all the sources on the podcast episode webpage if you want to see it. We pulled it from the ADA, Becker Dental, Dr. Bicuspid, etc. So number one is financial barriers. The average dental school grad walks out with $300,000 to $500,000 in debt. That's according to the ADA in 2023. If you add in the cost of buying or building a practice, which can run 6 to 7 figures, I mean, I wouldn't say 7 figures. That was the quote from the article. But let's say even if you're buying a $400,000 or $500,000 office, you're already in debt, $500,000. You're now looking at the potential of being $1 million in debt, and you're 28 years old. That's a bit scary. Okay, so. And then on top of that, if they've been working in the dental industry at all for a time, maybe they're not just straight out of school, there's now the challenges of running a practice. You've had they've worked in an office. They've seen the trouble that the doctor owner that they worked for had with staff, or they worked for a DSO and they saw the problems they were having and how overhead may have gone up and things of that nature. I think also, if you look in that, if a person's 30 or 35, that means they were born in 1990 or 1995. So if you're that age, you've lived through at least being aware of a couple of different economic crises. If you were 35 years old, you were probably a senior in high school when 2008 happened, when we had the great financial crisis, the big real estate meltdown. Maybe it didn't affect you personally. You didn't have a big portfolio at 18. Probably affected your parents, or you heard about it, and you lived through COVID. So you've seen these various economic uncertainties thrown in your face. So then maybe there's a bit of a nervousness associated with that. Do I really want to walk in and, be $500,000 in debt? I also know, just because my kids are in that age bracket, there's a definite different viewpoint on lifestyle as far as, what they want to do, work-life balance, things of that nature. And maybe they've watched practice owners that have zero work-life balance, and they think, well, I don't want to do that, so I'll just continue, working as an associate or work for a DSO. I mean, I think personally this can range, because obviously you're going to have as many reasons as you have individuals. But the bottom line is the pipeline, where maybe if you graduated in 81 or 85 and you had $30,000 or $40,000 in student debt, and then you went into private practice, that pipeline isn't like it used to be. Talked about this before, where if you graduated in the 80s, most likely in some schools in your fourth year, you were doing an externship. So you were actually on site in a practice working under another dentist. So you saw what private practice was like. I knew a couple of clients that actually just bought the practice that they externed in. You had a better idea of what this was going to look like. And you weren't, in debt to the nth degree when you walked into that situation. So I think that's a big reason. I think risk aversion might be a big reason. And again, if you have somebody walking out with $500,000 in debt and a DSO comes along, because they recruit heavily in dental schools, and you can see it by the surveys of fourth years, what they're looking at, what percentage are looking to go work for a DSO. That number's just gone up year over year. That the DSO looks like a better solution. You're going to go in, you're going to get a fixed salary, they're going to possibly help pay some of your debt, depending on how badly they really want to hire you, depending on how big of a deal they have as far as shortage of doctors. If you take states like Florida, Texas, and Arizona, over 30% of the dentists under 35 in those three states are affiliated with a DSO. Okay, 1 in 3 almost. So now that's been the big solution for the younger docs coming out. Now, what do I see? I see the docs on my end that have come out of a DSO environment, and I'm sure some of you listening have worked in or currently working in one of those environments, and then you get to hear all the negative associated with having worked in that DSO environment. They're not you probably have a different viewpoint now if you came out of that environment than you had going in. You see? Because, going in, it offers predictable income, no ownership headaches, ready-made infrastructure. You're drowning in loans as a new grad. It looks attractive. So they're recruiting pretty hard. All right, there's a sign-on bonus, whatever it is. But now let's look at what's happening with DSOs now. And I'm going to be very general here, because I don't want to deep dive on that. I have deep dove, whatever, on that before. But you have a few things going on. Number one, DSOs are definitely having more issues now than they were 5 years ago. The era of cheap debt is over, so some are facing financial pressure. Some are facing more regulatory scrutiny from the various states that they're in. Some DSOs have been restructuring because of various things that are happening. And on the dentist's side, because, if you look at the way that the whole DSO model grew, I think when I last looked at this, it was 30 out of 33 of the big DSOs in the United States are owned, and I'm trying to remember from a previous podcast, 30 out of 33, if I'm not mistaken, are owned primarily by private equity. Well, private equity has a model. They're going to go in, they're going to buy a company, they want to hold it usually for 5 years or less, and then sell that company at a profit, and while they own it, pull as much money out as they can. So some entrepreneurial doctor builds up a bunch of practices, and then a PE comes in and takes over, and they start injecting more money, and then eventually they want to dump it and make more money, right? That's the whole model. They don't really have the skill set, at least from what I've seen, and having talked to people in the DSO industry, or whatever you want to call it, DSO space. They don't really have the skill set to scale businesses, believe it or not. And by scale, I mean, how do you take that $30,000, $40,000 a month practice and get it up to doing 100, 150? Otherwise, they would be buying all these small offices. They just can't do it, and they don't do it. It's probably just not a great investment. But the idea is they don't want to hold on to it forever. The problem is now some of these private equity companies are having to hold on longer because they're not getting the profit level that they were expecting, and money isn't as free and easy as it used to be. From the dentist side, the story, isn't much better. As far as the feedback you get from that side, burnout is rampant, production quotas dominate. And I just want to comment on that. I have no problem with if you hire an associate saying, listen, I need you to produce at least $50,000 or $60,000 this month. Because the truth is, and I've said this before, if you look in your patient base and in your hygiene schedule, if you're actually growing your hygiene department properly and you're getting a steady flow of new patients, there's tons of work to do there. And I'm talking about just conservative dentistry, just restorative dentistry, even basic stuff. There's plenty of work to do there. There's no shortage of stuff. What I have a problem with is diagnostic quotas. You need to diagnose 40 crowns this month. Look, I'm not a dentist. I can't really comment on, well, I can. I think that's ridiculous. What if you don't see them? What if the crowns just aren't there? Like if I give you a number, I go, look, you're going to be seeing all these patients, and I know on average, the average number of patients you'll be seeing in a day when you're doing hygiene checks and new patients, you're going to be seeing at least $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 of potential treatment a day, and you're working 16 days a month. That's $160,000 a month in potential treatment you're going to see. If you're also doing your own case presentations, I would expect you to at least do 50 of the people that you're seeing. So I don't think that's unreasonable. A third of the people coming in, you got to close them for the treatment that they need, that you've diagnosed based on your knowledge of dentistry and what's the standard of care. I think that's fine. I'm not going to tell you, well, you need to diagnose this many crowns and this many this and this many that, because I don't know what patients are going to have when they walk in. I could be the best dentist in the planet, and I have no idea. I mean, statistically, I might have an idea of what the average person's going to have, but who knows? You don't know till you look at the patient. So I do disagree with that wholeheartedly. Diagnostic quotas are ridiculous as far as if it's based on specific procedures. You also get the complaint of micromanagement and loss of clinical autonomy. It's a constant complaint amongst dentists working there. And a lot of doctors just feel stuck. They just feel stuck. And I think one of the best quotes I saw on this, it was from an article in Becker Dental by Dr. David Blanchard. It was one of the quotes from him. He says this, he says, dentists who aren't even confident about treatment planning are being held to production quotas and are being pushed to bill more. Often the methods of doing so seem ethically questionable. When they don't meet quotas, they don't hit bonuses, and their pay suffers. This is a sad system. It motivates dentists for the wrong reasons. It's not good for the patients or the dentists. So, again, that's a statement from an individual. I think it's a pretty accurate statement. That's my opinion. But the point is this. If you look back to what made you go into dentistry, if you're a dentist, and I look at what I love about the dental industry, the thing I really love about it is you can go to a dentist, you can have a problem, and you walk out with the problem fixed. Maybe you're not going to get it delivered for a couple weeks because you're walking out with a temporary. Very few doctors do that. I walk into an internist, I'm sick, I might get an antibiotic, but I could walk in with a cracked tooth, I walk out with, I look better. It's a great profession. And good oral health leads to potentially a longer lifespan, better quality of life. I think it's really a win-win for both the doctor and the patient. I think it's a great profession. And I think that, especially when dentistry is practiced, up to the proper level or standard of care, rather, I think the outcome is spectacular. So why would I want anything to infringe on standard of care based on anything, especially if it's based on strictly financial issues? I think that, how much money we can make off a patient, I think that's definitely going the wrong way. And I wouldn't want that attitude or mentality entering the profession. And the last person I would want exposed to that is a younger doctor who's just trying to figure out what they're doing. You see? So what you see, it's funny because there's surveys of dentists who leave DSOs for private practice settings. And there's a couple interesting numbers here. One of them is they saw their satisfaction with clinical autonomy jump from 32% to 94%. I mean, think about that for a second. And maybe this applies to you. You worked for a DSO. You had to use this particular material. You didn't want to use, you wanted to use that material. You had to use this lab. You didn't want to use them. You want to use that lab, but you had no choice. Well, now you're in a private practice clinical setting. You can do what you feel is best for the patient. There's also satisfaction with business influence rose from 7% to 75%. This is from an article in Dental Post. So basically, the solution has now become, in my opinion, to a degree, a problem. And this isn't an attack on DSOs. Some are run better than others. But a younger doctor needs to know what they're walking into. And part of the issue is, and this has actually been an issue in dentistry for a long time, is there's been no business skills taught to the average dental school grad. And I don't want to get into a whole thing on this, but it's true. If I went to school and I learned how to be a healthcare professional and then I'm expected to go off and start my whole business, that's a whole other technology. Now I need to know how to deal with personnel and how to read a P&L and how to get a loan and how to set things up and set up systems. Well, that's not my area of expertise. I just learned to be a doctor, and that's where you can see the appeal comes from DSOs. So I think there needs to at least be some basic business school education for dentists. Because this happens, it's the reason why companies like MGE exist or our online platform DDS Success. It's one of the reasons they exist, because nobody's really doing it. How do you run a practice? And it's actually a lot easier than you think if you know exactly what you're doing. So I wanted to throw this out there. It's kind of a different episode, but this is, to me, a real problem. The next generation of dentists are not being prepared to continue the private practice of dentistry, like the current privately practicing practitioner. That was a long sentence. Like you are, the currently privately practicing practitioner. And I see that if the torch is not passed properly, we're going to end up with a situation where that gets diluted, and it's going to look a lot different in the years to come. So what is it that we can do about this? Well, there's a number of different things we can do. On the one hand, I can tell you what I've been telling our clients. There's lots of practices that are available now and will be available over the next 5-10 years. If your practice is running well, pick up another location and bring a younger doctor in to work with you. Obviously, they have to be able to produce and be a decent provider, but this is a good way to bring these folks in, give them an opportunity to work in a private environment, maybe mentor them a little bit so that you could be a potential business partner in the future. You might build up a whole network of different dentists that you work with, and you're partners with them in a bunch of different practices. I think that's a great idea. I think schools need to start getting at least some basic business skills taught to the students that they have. I also think that you might want to look at younger doctors that and offer some degree of mentorship, even if it's a study club. There's different things, and I'll get into at the end of the episode some specific immediate actions. But I would suggest that every dentist listening to this starts thinking with this. What the profession has done for you, and let's give back to the younger guys and girls so that they can actually continue it. Because private practice is the backbone of American dentistry, and right now, tens of thousands of those practices are about to hit the market as older doctors begin to retire. That means the younger doctors who are ready to step up potentially could find really excellent opportunities right now almost everywhere. The window is open. The question is, who's going to walk through it? Okay? And we have to create a better bridge from graduation to ownership. Maybe it's time to bring externships back. I don't know. But this is something that we all have to take a look at, because we have a whole crop of younger guys and girls that just don't own their own practices like they did 20 plus years ago. So most importantly, if I leave you with anything, I know this is one of those episodes where I didn't talk about how to close cases better or whatever. I would suggest that you do something about this. I'm doing what I can from my end with our clients and seeing if they can bring more younger doctors under their wing. Go talk at your alma mater. We have clients do that. They'll go to their alma mater and talk to fourth years about the virtues of private practice ownership, that it's not just this big black hole and you should just go work for a DSO instead. It's actually potentially rewarding. Invite them to your practice, maybe mentor them a little bit. Create a pathway into partnership by picking up multiple locations, because these practices are going to be available. If you're a younger dentist, start learning the business side. We can help. You can contact us here at MGE and take the plunge. The opportunity is there. It's never been so good. I've been saying this for a while. Don't wait for permission. It's necessary for the future of this profession, and it's also an incredible opportunity for you. It's making sure, in my opinion, that it isn't just about preserving the model, but it's making sure this next generation really gets the same shot that the last one did. Anyway, again, like I said, a bit of a different episode. Hope it wasn't too all over the place. What inspired me is, as I was doing my preparations, as I said earlier, I was actually shocked when I actually projected the numbers forward. It floored me. Up to 70,000 offices over the next 10 years. That's just crazy. So look, why don't we make sure those offices don't close and go away, and make sure we get some young entrepreneurial and good doctors in those offices and keep this thing going. Okay, folks? All right. Well, that's all I have for you this week. If you want to find out more about MGE, or if you need any help, you can contact us at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Other than that, the links to everything I just mentioned are on the episode webpage. Folks, have a great week, and I'll see you at the next episode.